8th of May, 1945. Vilvoorde, Belgium. 23-year-old Ilse Schneider stood in a line of German women prisoners, hands shaking, as British soldiers approached with clipboards and pens. She'd been a signals operator with the Luftwaffe, one of thousands of Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, female auxiliaries who'd served with German forces. Now she was a prisoner of war. Around her, women whispered prayers and clutched their few possessions. They'd all heard the stories. Propaganda had filled their heads with nightmares about what happened to German women captured by the enemy. Torture, starvation, worse. As a British sergeant stopped in front of her and asked her name, Ilse braced herself for the horror to begin. What happened next would shatter every expectation she'd held. And in the months that followed, she'd discover something that Nazi propaganda had never prepared her for. The British treated their prisoners with a dignity and humanity that seemed impossible after 6 years of total war. The end of the Second World War left Britain with an unexpected problem. German prisoners of war flooded into camps across the United Kingdom and occupied territories. By May 1945, over 400,000 German POWs were held on British soil. Most were men, soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy, or Western Europe. But among them were thousands of women. Nurses, signals operators, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, administrative staff. Women who'd worn Wehrmacht uniforms, served the Nazi war machine, and now found themselves prisoners of an enemy they'd been taught to fear and hate. The Wehrmacht-Helferin program had mobilized German women on an unprecedented scale. By 1944, over 450,000 women served in auxiliary roles with the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine. They weren't technically soldiers under German law, which complicated their status as prisoners. But they wore uniforms, followed military discipline, and worked in military installations. When they were captured, Allied forces treated them as POWs under the Geneva Convention. This was itself significant. Germany had employed women in military roles more extensively than any other nation. Britain, America, and the Soviet Union all had women's auxiliary services. But Germany's program was larger and more integrated into military operations. These women came from every background imaginable. Some were ardent National Socialists who believed wholeheartedly in Hitler's vision for Germany and Europe. They'd volunteered early, served with pride, and saw their work as contributing to the greatness of the Reich. Others were ordinary Germans caught up in the machinery of war, conscripted or volunteering for reasons ranging from patriotism to economic necessity. Many were teenagers, barely out of school, who'd been told they were serving their country in its hour of greatest need. Now they were prisoners, facing an uncertain future in the IE, hands of an enemy who had every reason to hate them. Nazi propaganda had been relentless in describing what happened to Germans captured by the British and Americans. Radio broadcasts spoke of starvation camps where prisoners were deliberately starved to death. Forced labor unto death, where German prisoners were worked until they collapsed and died. Systematic mistreatment that violated every principle of human decency. The propaganda stressed that Germany's enemies were barbaric, especially towards women. Soviet atrocities on the Eastern Front, where German women faced horrific violence during the Red Army's advance, were held up as examples of what all enemies would do. German soldiers were told that surrender meant death or worse. German women were told the same, with additional emphasis on sexual violence. The propaganda had been effective because it wasn't entirely fabricated from nothing. Soviet troops had committed terrible atrocities against German women. This was documented, undeniable, and used by Nazi propagandists to create fear of all Allied forces. The logic was simple. If the Soviets do this, the British and Americans must be the same, or worse. After all, they're all allies. They're all enemies of Germany. They all want revenge. This reasoning, while flawed, was persuasive to people who'd lived through 6 years of total war and had little access to accurate information. Ilse Schneider later recalled her thoughts as British soldiers processed her into captivity. "I was certain I would not survive the week. Everything we'd been told, every news report, every whispered story from soldiers returning from the West, all of it said the British were cruel. They would starve us, work us to death, perhaps assault us. I'd heard that British soldiers raped German women with as much brutality as the Russians. I believed it all. Why wouldn't I? It was what everyone said. My mother had told me to take my own life rather than be captured. I'd seriously considered it, but I was too frightened to die and too frightened to live." The reality began to diverge from propaganda almost immediately. At the initial collection points, British soldiers separated men from women, which itself was surprising. In the chaos of the war's end, many prisoners expected to be herded together without regard for sex or age. Instead, the British showed immediate organization. The women were taken to separate holding areas where female personnel handled much of the processing. They were given medical examinations by female doctors or nurses when possible. They were deloused, a necessary if undignified process. They were issued clean clothing to replace their often filthy uniforms. Food was provided. Not luxurious, but adequate. British rations, the same food British troops ate. Tea, bread, tinned meat, vegetables. For women who'd been surviving on starvation rations in the final months of the war, it was almost overwhelming. British policy towards POWs was guided by several factors. First and foremost, legal obligation under the Geneva Convention of 1929. Britain had been a signatory and took international law seriously, partly from principle, partly from practical concern for British POWs held by Germany. Throughout the war, Britain had protested German violations of the convention and insisted on maintaining standards for German prisoners, hoping this would encourage reciprocal treatment. Second, political consideration. Britain wanted to demonstrate to the world, especially to neutral nations and future allies, that it was better than the Nazis, that democracy and civilization could triumph over barbarism without descending to barbarism themselves. This was propaganda, certainly, but propaganda backed by genuine policy. Third, practical utility. Germany was devastated. The country would need to be rebuilt, and these prisoners would eventually be repatriated to help with that reconstruction. Treating them decently might help in future relations and make occupation easier. Fourth, economic benefit. Britain needed labor. The war had drained the country of workers. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Others were still serving overseas. Farms needed workers. Factories needed workers. Reconstruction needed workers. German POWs, male and female, could fill that gap if they were kept healthy and willing to work. But there was also something deeper, something that British officials found harder to articulate, but that shaped policy nonetheless. A sense among many British people that while the Nazi regime was evil beyond measure, ordinary Germans caught up in the war were not necessarily monsters. This attitude varied wildly, of course. Some Britons, especially those who'd lost family in the Blitz or in combat, harbored intense hatred towards all Germans. They saw every prisoner as complicit in Nazi crimes. Others, particularly those working directly with prisoners, saw frightened young women who were as much victims of Hitler as anyone. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in between. The camps for German women prisoners were established rapidly in the weeks following Germany's surrender. Most were in Britain, Belgium, or northwestern Germany, in territory under British control. The camp at Vilvoorde in Belgium housed several thousand women at its peak. Others were scattered across England, often converted from existing military installations, or constructed quickly using temporary structures. Unlike camps for men, which sometimes used barbed wire fences and guard towers reminiscent of wartime prisoner compounds, women's camps were generally less fortified. Escape was rare. Where would they go? Britain was an island surrounded by Allied-controlled waters. Belgium and Germany were under Allied occupation. Most prisoners quickly realized that attempting escape was pointless and dangerous. Daily life in the camps followed a strict routine, much like military life. Reveille at 6 in the morning, with guards or senior prisoners waking everyone. Breakfast at 7, eaten in mess halls or communal areas. Work details began at 8 and continued until noon, with a break for lunch. Afternoon work lasted from 1 until 5. Dinner at 6. Free time from 7 until 9. Lights out at 10. The routine was designed to keep prisoners occupied, maintain discipline, and prevent the despair that could come from idleness. The work varied considerably depending on the camp's location and Britain's needs. Some women worked in camp kitchens, preparing meals for hundreds or thousands of prisoners. Others worked in laundries, washing sheets, uniforms, and other textiles. Some were assigned to administrative duties, maintaining camp records, distributing mail, or helping with translations. Many were sent out on work details to farms desperately short of labor after 6 years of war. British agriculture had relied heavily on the Women's Land Army during the war, but with the war over, many of these women wanted to return to civilian life. German prisoners filled the gap, picking crops, tending animals, and maintaining farm equipment. Others worked in factories producing textiles, consumer goods, or materials for reconstruction. Some worked in hospitals as orderlies or assistants, though not in medical capacities requiring qualifications. British law, following the Geneva Convention, required that POWs receive payment for their labor. The wages were small, far less than what British workers earned for comparable work. But they could spend them in camp canteens, on toiletries, chocolate, cigarettes, and writing materials. For prisoners who'd lost everything, the ability to earn even a small amount and purchase small comforts was significant. The food, while not luxurious, was consistent and adequate. British rations in 1945 were austere by modern standards. The country was still under strict rationing that would continue until 1954, longer than the war itself had lasted. But prisoners received the same rations as British civilians or soldiers, which was more than adequate to maintain health. Breakfast was typically porridge or bread with margarine and tea. Lunch was soup, bread, and occasionally cheese or cold meat. Dinner was a hot meal, typically something like stew, mashed potatoes, and vegetables. Once a week there might be pudding or a dessert. Compared to the starvation rations of the last months of the war, when German civilians often survived on a few hundred calories a day and supplemented their diet with grass or bark, this was abundance. Medical care was a revelation for many prisoners. British doctors and nurses treated German prisoners with the same professional care they'd give anyone. This wasn't universal. Some medical staff struggled with treating those they saw as enemies. But it was official policy and generally observed. Women who were ill received treatment. Those with chronic conditions got medication. Dental care was provided, something many prisoners hadn't had access to for years. Pregnant women, of which there were some who'd been captured while expecting, received prenatal care and delivered their babies in hospitals or camp infirmaries attended by trained midwives. The babies, born in captivity, were British subjects by law, but were recorded as German nationals for repatriation purposes. This medical care shocked many prisoners. They'd expected neglect at best, cruelty at worst. Instead, they found competence and compassion. British medical personnel, despite sometimes harboring resentment towards Germans, maintained professional standards. The Hippocratic Oath didn't distinguish between friend and enemy. A patient was a patient. This professionalism, combined with Britain's genuine commitment to the Geneva Convention, meant that German prisoners received medical care that was often better than what German civilians were receiving in the ruins of Germany. Gisela Weber, a 20-year-old anti-aircraft auxiliary captured near Hamburg in May 1945, wrote in a letter to her mother later that year, "I cannot explain how strange it is. The British treat us correctly, even kindly. When I was ill with fever last month, the English nurse stayed with me through the night. She gave me aspirin and cool cloths for my head. She spoke gently, though I could barely understand her English. She showed me photographs of her own children, both boys, and explained through gestures that one had been killed in France. Yet still she cared for me. Mother, I thought they would let us die. Instead, they healed me. I am ashamed that I believed the lies we were told about these people." The British government initiated a re-education program for German POWs in 1945. The goal was multifaceted: to demonstrate the evils of Nazism, to show the benefits of democracy, and to prepare prisoners for eventual return to a Germany that would need to be rebuilt on different principles. For male prisoners, this meant lectures, films, and discussions about German war crimes, the Holocaust, and democratic governance. Prisoners attended screenings of German concentration camp footage. They listened to testimonies from survivors. They read newspapers reporting on the Nuremberg trials. They participated in discussions led by German-speaking British officers or anti-Nazi German exiles. For women prisoners, the program was similar but adapted. They attended screenings of films about concentration camps, footage that many refused to believe was real at first. The images were so horrific that prisoners insisted they must be staged, propaganda fabricated to make Germans look evil. British authorities expected this reaction. They showed multiple sources, brought in witnesses, provided documentation. They listened to lectures about how propaganda had manipulated them, how the Nazi regime had used their patriotism and fear to support policies they might not have supported if they'd known the truth. They participated in discussions about democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The reaction varied wildly, depending on age, education, and ideological commitment. Some women, particularly younger ones who'd joined the Wehrmacht-Helferin program out of duty or necessity rather than ideological commitment, were receptive. They'd believed they were serving their country, defending Germany from enemies. Confronted with evidence of what their country had actually done, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the enslavement and murder of millions of others, the aggressive wars that had devastated Europe, they felt betrayed and ashamed. Some experienced genuine psychological crises, unable to reconcile the Germany they'd believed in with the reality of what Germany had done. Others, especially those who'd been fervent believers in National Socialism, rejected it all as enemy propaganda. They insisted the films were staged, the testimonies were coerced or fabricated, the lecturers were brainwashing them. They maintained that Germany had fought a defensive war, that Allied bombing of German cities was the real crime, that any atrocities attributed to Germany were either exaggerated or justified by the exigencies of war. The British didn't force acceptance. They presented the information, allowed debate, and hoped that time and reflection would do the rest. For some prisoners, it did. For others, they left captivity still believing in the Nazi cause, though perhaps more quietly than before. Recreation was surprisingly important in camp administration. British authorities recognized that bored prisoners were unhappy prisoners, and unhappy prisoners caused problems. Discipline deteriorated, resentment grew, escape attempts increased, depression became endemic, So the camps organized activities to keep prisoners occupied during their free time. Football matches were organized, though these were less common in women's camps than in men's camps. Theatrical productions were staged, with prisoners writing scripts, making costumes, and performing for their fellow inmates. Musical concerts were held, with prisoners who'd been professional or amateur musicians before the war performing classical and popular music. Craft workshops taught skills like sewing, knitting, and woodworking. These weren't just recreational. They produced items that prisoners could use or trade. Libraries were established, stocked with German language books. The selection included classics like Goethe and Schiller, contemporary literature that wasn't explicitly Nazi propaganda, and even some Nazi-approved works that hadn't been banned. British authorities took a surprisingly liberal approach, believing that banning books would create resentment and that prisoners should be allowed to read widely and form their own judgments. Education classes taught English, typing, shorthand, and other skills that might be useful after repatriation. Some prisoners showed remarkable aptitude, learning English to near fluency within months. Others struggled, hampered by lack of education, lack of motivation, or simple difficulty with languages. But the opportunity was there, and thousands took advantage of it. For many young women who'd had their education interrupted by the war, it was their first chance in years to learn something new. The Isle of Man hosted a unique camp at Russian that had operated since 1940. It had become Europe's only all-female civilian internment camp during the war. It housed not just German prisoners captured in military service, but also German and Austrian nationals who'd been living in Britain before the war. Many were Jewish refugees who'd fled the Nazis but were classified as enemy aliens and interned for security reasons, an irony not lost on anyone involved. A Jewish woman fleeing Nazi persecution only to be imprisoned by Britain because of her German passport exemplified the cruel absurdities that wartime security measures sometimes produced. The Russian camp was unlike any other. Women lived in requisitioned boarding houses and hotels, not barracks or huts. They had actual bedrooms, sometimes shared, but still more comfortable than the dormitory arrangements common elsewhere. They could walk on the beach during the day, albeit within defined boundaries. They shopped in local stores, interacting with Manx civilians who treated them with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. They attended church services, both Catholic and Protestant, often sharing pews with local worshippers. The camp was run largely by women for women, with minimal military presence beyond perimeter guards. After the war, when military prisoners began to be processed through Russian or held there temporarily, the atmosphere remained relatively relaxed. Many internees chose to stay in Britain after their release, having formed lasting friendships with the local families who'd housed them or interacted with them. Some married British men. Others found work and built new lives. The Russian camp represented the most benign form of wartime captivity possible, though it was never luxurious, and separation from family was always painful. But the mainland camps, while more restrictive than Russian, still operated under rules that surprised German prisoners expecting brutal treatment. By late 1946, as the immediate post-war crisis eased, restrictions had been considerably relaxed. Prisoners could leave camps on supervised outings. Groups would be taken to nearby towns to attend church services. They visited libraries and museums. Some went to concerts or theater performances. Others simply walked through parks, experiencing normal civilian life after months or years of regimentation. Male and female prisoners were allowed to interact under supervision, which led to some romances and eventual marriages. This was carefully monitored. British authorities didn't want inappropriate relationships or situations that might lead to discipline problems. But they recognized that preventing all interaction between men and women was both impractical and inhumane. By 1947, many restrictions were lifted entirely. Prisoners could go into nearby towns unescorted, mix freely with civilians, and even attend social events. This represented remarkable trust and reflected Britain's confidence that most prisoners were neither dangerous nor likely to cause problems. This openness led to relationships between German women prisoners and British men, which became one of the most controversial aspects of post-war Britain. Initially forbidden under strict non-fraternization regulations, these relationships persisted despite official disapproval. British soldiers, demobilized and returning to civilian life, encountered German prisoners working on farms or in factories. Some were charmed, others were curious. A few fell genuinely in love. By June 1947, marriages were officially permitted between POWs and British citizens. Within months, hundreds of marriages took place. The War Office recorded 784 official marriages by 1949, though the actual number was certainly higher, as some couples waited until after repatriation to marry. These weren't easy relationships. The war's wounds were still fresh. Many Britons viewed such marriages as betrayals, arguing that British women had lost husbands and sons to German aggression, and now British men were marrying German women. Some German women were ostracized by their fellow prisoners for consorting with the enemy, or accused of trying to avoid repatriation by marrying British men. Families on both sides often disapproved. But love, as it does, found a way. Couples navigated the bureaucracy, dealt with disapproval, and built lives together. Many of these marriages lasted decades. Some ended in divorce. All represented the complicated human reality that existed beneath the grand narratives of war and peace. The experience of captivity transformed many prisoners' views of Britain and themselves. Ingrid Hoffmann, captured in April 1945, while serving as a radio operator with a Luftwaffe radar unit, spent 2 years in British captivity. In an interview conducted in 1985 on the 40th anniversary of VE Day, she reflected, "When I arrived in that camp, I hated the British with every fiber of my being. They were the enemy. They'd bombed our cities, killed my brother in North Africa, destroyed my country. I believed everything Goebbels said about them. But in 2 years in that camp, British soldiers treated me with more respect and kindness than some of my German officers ever had. I learned English from a British sergeant who'd lost his son at Caen. I learned to see beyond propaganda from a British nurse who'd survived the bombing of her hospital in London. I met British women who'd lost sons and husbands to German bombs and submarines, yet they spoke to me without hatred, only sadness. It changed me completely. I returned to Germany in 1947, a different person than the one who'd been captured in 1945. Not every prisoner had such positive experiences, of course. Camps varied in quality depending on commanders, local conditions, and resources. Some prisoners reported harsh treatment, inadequate food, or callous guards who made no effort to hide their contempt. The transition from active war to peacetime occupation was messy. Resources were strained. Britain itself was exhausted and impoverished from 6 years of total war. Rationing was severe. Cities needed rebuilding. The economy needed restarting. The empire was beginning to dissolve. In this context, providing for hundreds of thousands of prisoners while British citizens themselves struggled was controversial. Some camps reflected this tension with overworked staff, inadequate supplies, and prisoners who felt neglected or mistreated. These conditions rarely rose to the level of Geneva Convention violations, but they created hardship and resentment. Complaints were filed, investigated, and sometimes resulted in improvements or disciplinary action against guards or administrators. The system wasn't perfect, But it generally functioned as designed, with oversight and accountability that prisoners from authoritarian Germany found surprisingly effective. But compared to what prisoners feared based on propaganda, and compared to what happened in other contexts, British treatment was notably humane. German POWs held by the Soviets faced horrific conditions that killed hundreds of thousands. Millions of German prisoners were marched east to labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia. They worked in mines, forests, and construction projects in brutal conditions. Disease, malnutrition, and exposure killed enormous numbers. Of roughly 3 million German prisoners taken by the Soviets, approximately one-third died in captivity. Those who survived often weren't released until the mid-1950s, a full decade after the war ended. German prisoners held by France also faced harsh treatment, though not on the Soviet scale. French anger after 4 years of brutal occupation was understandable. German prisoners worked in dangerous conditions, clearing minefields and unexploded ordnance. Food was inadequate, leading to malnutrition and disease. Discipline was sometimes arbitrary and cruel. Tens of thousands died in French captivity. Even American-held prisoners, while generally treated well according to the Geneva Convention, sometimes faced difficult conditions in the immediate aftermath of the war, when the sheer number of prisoners overwhelmed camp facilities. The Rhine-Wiesenlager, massive open-air camps holding German prisoners along the Rhine in spring and summer 1945, became notorious for inadequate shelter, food, and sanitation that led to thousands of deaths. British camps, while far from comfortable or desirable places to be, maintained standards that reflected Britain's commitment to international law and basic human decency. This wasn't altruism or weakness. It was policy driven by legal obligation, political calculation, and cultural values that had survived 6 years of brutal warfare. Britain had fought the war in part to defend the idea that there were rules, that civilization meant something, that victory didn't justify abandoning principles. Treating prisoners correctly was part of demonstrating that Britain meant what it said about defending civilization against barbarism. The question of why Britain treated prisoners relatively well, especially compared to other Allied nations, has multiple answers that historians continue to debate. Legal obligation under the Geneva Convention was certainly one factor. Britain had been instrumental in developing international humanitarian law and took such obligations seriously. Violating the convention would have been embarrassing internationally and would have undermined Britain's moral position. Political advantage was another clear factor. Britain wanted to demonstrate moral superiority over the Nazis, to show the world that democracy was not just militarily superior, but ethically superior. Treating prisoners well was propaganda, but propaganda backed by genuine policy and action. But there was also a cultural factor that's harder to quantify, but arguably just as important. British society, despite experiencing 6 years of total war, including the existential threat of invasion and the trauma of the Blitz, maintained a sense that there were rules even in total war, that enemies were still human beings entitled to basic decency. That victory didn't justify descending to the level of those one fought against. This wasn't universal. There were certainly British soldiers and civilians who wanted revenge, who felt that Germans, having started the war and committed such atrocities, deserved no mercy. But British institutions, from the War Office to individual camp commanders to individual guards, generally operated under the principle that prisoners were to be treated correctly according to law and basic human dignity. This cultural attitude had deep roots in British history and tradition. The concept of fair play might seem quaint or even naive, but it shaped British behavior in ways that surprised Germans accustomed to a more brutal military culture. German prisoners repeatedly commented on being shocked by British courtesy, by guards who said please and thank you, by commanders who explained decisions rather than simply issuing orders. This wasn't weakness or naivety. It was a different way of exercising authority, one rooted in respect for law and procedure rather than raw power. By 1946, most female prisoners had been repatriated. The men stayed longer. Britain needed their labor for reconstruction, which was controversial and arguably violated the Geneva Convention's requirement for prompt repatriation after hostilities ended. The last German POWs weren't released from British custody until late 1948, more than 3 years after the war ended. But the women, deemed less useful for heavy labor and more of a burden in terms of facilities and security, were sent home relatively quickly. Most were back in Germany by late 1946 or early 1947. They returned to a Germany that no longer existed. The Reich had been divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by Britain, America, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin itself was divided into 4 sectors. The country had been physically and morally destroyed. Cities were nothing but rubble. Hamburg, where Gisela Weber had lived, was 70% destroyed. Dresden was virtually erased from the map. Berlin was a moonscape of ruins. Infrastructure was shattered. Railways didn't run. Bridges were collapsed. Roads were cratered. Factories were destroyed or dismantled for reparations. The economy had ceased to function. People survived by barter and black market trading. Families were scattered across zones that were increasingly difficult to cross as Cold War tensions rose. Millions of ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe flooded into what remained of Germany, overwhelming the capacity of the shattered country to absorb them. Starvation was widespread. The winter of 1946 to 1947, known as the Hunger Winter, killed thousands. Tuberculosis, typhus, and other diseases flourished in the ruins. The Germany these women returned to was unrecognizable from the one they'd left. For many, repatriation was bittersweet. They were going home, which they desperately wanted during their captivity. But home was often destroyed physically and changed utterly in every other way. The experience of British captivity had changed them as well. They'd seen that the enemy wasn't the monster they'd been told to expect. They'd been treated with a decency that their own government hadn't always shown them. They'd learned that propaganda was lies, that democracy might actually be better than dictatorship, that the world was more complicated than Nazi ideology had portrayed. This created a psychological conflict, relief at returning home, but also a strange nostalgia for captivity, where at least life had been predictable, safe, and relatively comfortable compared to the chaos of post-war Germany. Some women chose not to return. Those who'd married British men obviously stayed in Britain, beginning the lengthy process of integrating into British society while maintaining connections to their German heritage. But others also requested permission to remain in Britain even without marriage, finding work as domestic servants, factory workers, or nurses. British authorities, after initial reluctance, allowed some to stay. These women integrated into British society with varying degrees of success, often changing their names to sound less German, learning perfect English without accents, and building new lives far from the country of their birth. They rarely spoke about their wartime service or their experiences. The shame of having served the Nazi regime, combined with the difficulty of explaining their complex feelings about captivity, led most to simply reinvent themselves and move forward. The treatment of German women POWs by Britain stands as a testament to what's possible even in the darkest times. It wasn't perfect. There were failures, injustices, and moments where the system fell short of its own standards. Individual guards were cruel. Some camp commanders were incompetent. Resources were sometimes inadequate, but overall, the system worked remarkably well, demonstrating that even after 6 years of total war, even after the Holocaust, even after the Blitz and the U-boat campaign, and all the horrors, Britain maintained a commitment to treating prisoners according to law and basic humanity. This wasn't weakness, though some at the time and since have characterized it as such. It was strength. The strength to maintain principles even when it would have been easier and perhaps more emotionally satisfying to abandon them. It would have been easy to say that Germans deserved whatever they got after what Germany had done. It would have been understandable to treat German prisoners with the same brutality that German forces had shown to others. But Britain, imperfectly and with exceptions, chose not to. This choice reflected what Britain said it was fighting for: democracy, rule of law, human rights, civilization itself. The women who experienced this treatment carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Many spoke of it in later years, particularly as they aged and the war receded from immediate experience into history. They spoke with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Gratitude for the decency they'd been shown when they'd expected nothing but cruelty. Confusion at why an enemy would do that, why captors would show mercy to those who'd served a regime that had shown so little mercy to others. The answer, perhaps, lies in understanding that Britain fought the war not just to defeat Germany, but to defend a set of values: democracy, rule of law, human rights, the dignity of every person regardless of nationality or circumstances. To have abandoned those values in victory would have made the victory hollow, a triumph of force rather than principle. Britain understood this, imperfectly and inconsistently, but enough to make a real difference in how hundreds of thousands of prisoners experienced captivity. This wasn't just propaganda or public relations. It was genuine policy implementation that touched individual lives in profound ways. Today, when survivors speak of those years, and few remain now, 80 years after the war's end, they often describe a journey from propaganda to reality, from fear to understanding, from hatred to something more complex that's harder to name. They don't forget that they were on the wrong side, that they served a regime that committed unthinkable crimes, that their uniforms represented something evil. But they also remember that when they were most vulnerable, when they expected the worst, they found something better. They found that even enemies can be merciful, that even in war, humanity can survive, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't force or violence, but the simple act of treating others with dignity and basic decency, even when you have every reason not to. This legacy matters today. In a world where armed conflicts continue, where prisoners are still taken and held, where the temptation to dehumanize enemies remains strong, the example of how Britain treated German women prisoners in 1945 reminds us of what's possible. That maintaining principles during war isn't naive or weak. That treating prisoners according to law isn't giving comfort to the enemy, but upholding the values that make victory worthwhile. That mercy, properly understood, isn't weakness but strength. The German women who expected brutality but found humanity instead became unwitting witnesses to this truth. Their stories, preserved in letters, interviews, and memoirs, testify to a moment when Britain, exhausted and impoverished by 6 years of total war, chose to honor its commitments and uphold its values. Not perfectly, not without exceptions or failures, but enough to make a difference. Enough that women who'd been taught to hate the British discovered that propaganda had lied, that enemies could be decent, and that even in war's aftermath, humanity could prevail.